My name is Glenn Benson, and I am the Honorary Curator of Artefacts for the Linnean Society of London. And my role involves looking after things like the paintings on the walls around us here, for those of us who are... Oops, sorry. Maybe they need to be a bit closer. Oh, is that okay? So for those of you who are with us in person this evening, we're sitting in a room which has a number of portraits on the wall, and part of my role is to look after those portraits. But the main reason we're here this evening is to welcome our speaker, Advolly Richmond. But before I hand over the floor to her, I just thought we'd talk a little bit about the Linnean Society for those people who don't know who we are. We were founded in 1788. We are the oldest society for the study of natural history in the world. And our purpose is really to kind of help people understand the natural world so that they can better protect it. And it links in quite nicely with the quotation from Advolly's website. And I would really recommend going to her website because it's got some amazing things on it. This is a very prolific social historian, gardener. The list is endless.
All around perfect human being.
Absolutely. And modest too. But there's a lovely section on the website that it caught my eye because it says that Advolly lectures on a variety of garden history subjects from the 16th to the 20th century. She is researching the life and legacy of Richard Thomas Birch Freeman, who we're talking about this evening. But also, I liked what it says, that you advocate that garden history is for everyone. It helps us to understand the value of historic designed landscapes, parks, cemeteries, and many other green spaces. And this is the thing that really caught me, which was because only when you understand the values can you protect it for future generations. And that breaks very neatly into what our view is too, is that you need to understand the natural world so that we can better protect it for the future. So I'm going to close at that point, only just by saying, if you're not a fellow of the Linnean Society, why not? Please join us. Cadden will be putting a link into the chat, and you can join us and become a fellow too.
I'm just going to manage the screen a bit.
Okay. Do you want me to carry on?
No, carry on, please.
Okay. Yes, so please do think about joining. I think I've persuaded one person to come off by this thing. So you're not getting out without. Yeah, absolutely. So without further ado, I'd just like to hand over to our brilliant speaker for this evening, Advolly Richmond.
Well, thank you very much for that, Glenn. That was really sweet of you. Thank you. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this evening about Thomas Birch Freeman. Now, the Reverend Thomas Birch Freeman was an Anglo-African missionary, Methodist missionary, and he was effectively is that better? Is that okay? Can you hear me? And he was effectively the founder of Methodism in Ghana, well, modern day Ghana. And he's been overshadowed to such an extent, and which is why I'm so excited to be researching him. And he founded so many schools and churches in West Africa, but his legacy in the Britain's colonial economic botany, horticulture, botany, taxonomy has been greatly overshadowed. So this evening, I would like to share elements of his life. And I've been researching him for about 8 years now, and I've grown extremely fond of this man. And I've been through quite a lot with him, his trials and his tribulations. Now, over the years, quite a lot of books have been written about Birch Freeman. However, most of them tend to gloss over the area that I am interested in. I had the privilege of speaking to Paul Ellingworth a couple of years ago before he passed away in 2018. And he wrote Freeman's case in 1997. And he says, the period between 1857 and 1873 is naturally of less interest to the mission historian, and the latter part of this period remains largely obscure. And for decades, missionary historians have laid claim to Freeman. In each case, they have overlooked his contributions in horticulture, plant collecting, and even agriculture. And as I said, this is the area that I'm most interested in, because this is when he was communicating with Veitch nurseries, he was communicating with Lydigia's nursery in Hackney, and he was also communicating with the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and the wider colonies. In 2018, my husband and I travelled to Ghana to have a look at Birch Freeman's papers, his family papers, which have, most of them have survived. And it was really, really good feeling to finally arrive in Accra, having been speaking to the archivist for over 2 years. And what we found were these letterbooks. And as you can see, they're not in a very good condition at all. But what you do see is that he provides a first-hand account of historical and ethnographical information. Now, following this, I was then able to access his journals, which are at SOAS. And again, this was after hounding, and I mean hounding, the core heritage officer of the Methodist heritage team. And again, as you can see, these are not in very good condition, and this is one of the better ones. Now, the journals provide a narrative of his many endeavors and exploits, and it shows a rather savvy but compassionate man with a wonderful sense of humor. His Latin is exemplary, which serves to illustrate a deep understanding of horticulture, botany, taxonomy, ornithology, as well as the world of entomology and bryology. At present, his story begins at the Harlands, the siege of the Harlands at Orwell Park in Ipswich. And here he arrived at the age of 17. And in his own words, he later confirmed that he'd actually spent 10 years at Orwell Park with the Harlands. And Sir Robert and Lady Arethusa Harland appear to have been quite an important thread in his life. Fortunately, very little of their family archives have remained. But using newspaper sources and other archives, it becomes apparent that since the mid-1700s, the Orwell Park has been steeped in botany and horticulture, because Arethusa's uncle, Francis Vernon, served as the commissioner on the Board of Trade and Plantations, and he had several hothouses at Orwell, all full of exotic plants. Therefore, it's unsurprising that Arethusa then became such a keen and accomplished plantswoman. And she kept a commonplace book which details all her botanical interests. So, for instance, in 1824, she was highly praised by Curtis's Botanical Magazine for her success with a rather unwilling plant, Epomia speciosa. And the publication recorded that this is one of the most beautiful species of this extensive genus, introduced by the late Right Honourable Sir Joseph Banks from the East Indies, which was in 1778, but has rarely flowered in our hothouses, and our specimen was communicated by Lady Harland of Orwell Park, and it flowered in her stoves in August, September, October 1822. And Lady Harland goes on to detail the cultural requirements of this plant and its habits and how, it really did flourish in her hothouses. But the first reference we find of Birch Freeman was at the end of June in 1833. And he was only 24 years old but he was listed as one of the judges of the Ipswich Horticultural Society, and the Suffolk Chronicle reported that the second meeting for the present year was held at the Royal William Inn, and it was more numerously attended than on any former occasion. The judges were Mr. Farrow, gardener to Sir William Middleton, and Mr. Freeman, gardener to Sir Robert Harland. So as the head gardener at Orwell Park, there are many more accounts of his involvement with the Ipswich Horticultural Society. So it means that he must have been a well-respected gardener and planter. So where did this man come from? We know that he was born in 1809 in Twyford, Hampshire. His mother, Amy Birch, was white, a housekeeper, and his father, Thomas, was a gardener at the same household. And he's said to have died when Freeman was 6 years old, and he was most probably had been enslaved in St. Vincent in the West Indies, and this would explain the surname Freeman. It has been suggested on many occasions that Freeman had an element of education at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. Unfortunately, Kew's pre-1841 archival records have not survived. Up to now, it has been difficult to ascertain the exact circumstances by which Birch Freeman came to acquire his vast knowledge, sort of horticultural natural history knowledge. Undoubtedly, the Harlands did assist him greatly. However, my research has found another candidate, as I was explaining to Glenn earlier on, another person, a botanist in their own right, who showed incredible interest in Birch Freeman's progress, his sort of botanical educational progress. And so I'm still scrabbling around, trying to corroborate some of this information. Now, by all accounts, Freeman was a handsome man, 6 foot tall with a cultured bearing, and a friend of his recalled seeing him in his cozy little library within the grounds of Orwell Park. But at some point, Freeman decided to pursue his religious interests, and so he started visiting the sick and the poor in his neighborhood, and this greatly irritated the local vicar, who then went and complained to Sir Harland about his Methodist gardener. And anxious to quash these horrible rumors of his Methodist gardener, he gave him an ultimatum, and he said, you can either keep your job or you can, go to your God. And so, with a heavy heart, Freeman tendered his resignation. And this decision coincided with an appeal from the Wesleyan Methodist Society, and it decided the matter for him. And at his interview in London, the society took one look at him and decided that he might actually better serve in West Africa, because he had told them that he'd spent many, many years in hot houses, so he'd be all right. So he'd be all right in really high temperatures. But more importantly, they actually looked at him and they thought, right, okay, most of their missionaries had died from malaria and other horrible infectious diseases. And they actually calculated that there was a high probability that his African heritage would actually give him some kind of resistance, because for a long time, this region was known as the white man's grave, and with very good reason too. Therefore, Freeman's survival to the ripe old age of 80 was testament to the committee's shrewd judgment. Therefore, on Saturday, the 4th of November, 1837, 28 years old, newly ordained, newly married to Elizabeth Boot, the housekeeper at Orwell Park, who he called Betsy, They sailed from Gravesend on the Osborne for the Gold Coast. And during his crossing, he started that first journal that we saw, where he detailed the latitude, longitude, all sorts of scientific information, as well as sort of the weather. And Queen Victoria had been on the throne just 5 months. When they landed at Cape Coast Castle on Wednesday, the 3rd of January, 1838, this would have been Freeman and Betsy's first glimpse of the infamous Cape Coast Castle. Infamous because this was one of the 3 corners of the triangular slave trade. And this actually instigated Birch Freeman later on to become very much involved with some of the well-known abolitionists back in the UK. And Cape Coast Castle was a fort surrounded by an African village, and this is where the British interests in the area were conducted from. And once they reached the shore and they went to the mission house, they were then greeted with the devastating news that the rest of the missionaries had died while they were on their way. So it was just him and his wife. It rapidly became apparent that Freeman possessed a natural empathy with the indigenous people on the Gold Coast. He observed their customs and their long drawn-out processes and their ceremonies, and he consistently treated everybody exactly the same, whether they were the African or the Europeans at Cape Coast Castle. And he also took full advantage of the freedom that was given to him, which allowed him to study, document, and collect plants. Over the centuries, many missionaries have been at the forefront of natural history and plant collecting because I feel that it's because they sometimes came across as being non-confrontational, and therefore they were able to gain unique access to places where some of the people might not have. And on many occasions, while traveling around, his quiet diplomacy averted many incidences and misunderstandings. And like many missionaries before him and after, he quickly developed a routine around his religious commitments. And most of the time, he would travel from place to place, and in between, he would go out in the bush, or he would take a canoe and go up and down the river, making notes of any animals, any plants, anything that took his interest. On one occasion, as he was strolling through the forest, he wrote in his journal, "At a few hundred yards distant, I beheld a tree of wondrous beauty. It was about 30 feet in height and covered with flowers as large as tulips, and equally rich and gaudy." And going by the description that he gives, I think he was talking about Spithodia campanulata, which is also known as the African tulip tree. And he then goes on to compare it very favorably with the Himalayan rhododendron arboreum, which had been introduced into England in 1811. He then continues, "My feelings while gazing on this floral wonder were akin to those of Linnaeus when he knelt in rapture to gaze on the firs in full blossom." Now, this is interesting because, again, it points to a singular education. Because in 1736, during a visit to England, Carl Linnaeus is said to have fallen to his knees in wonder at the mass of the yellow gorse flowering across Putney Heath in London. I don't know whether that's true or not. Freeman concludes that it is questionable whether he would ever see such a specimen in the conservatories of England. Exactly 30 days after his arrival on the Gold Coast, he was struck down with a fever, and this was his first bout of malaria. As a rule, most Europeans arriving there were expected to go through such an initial attack, which is why it was known as seasoning fever. However, his fever was so bad that he was actually blind for several weeks. And when he finally recovered, he discovered that Betsy had not survived hers. And she had been buried, he'd missed her funeral, she'd been buried by the European merchants at Cape Coast Castle, who then proceeded to look after him while he was convalescing. Once he was able to travel, he was taken to a small and rather derelict plantation owned by Andrew Swansea, an English merchant. And the plantation was called Napoleon because it was full of willow trees, which had come from Napoleon Bonaparte's tomb in St. Helena, which was several miles south of the Gold Coast. Now, this particular willow, probably Salix babylonica, was notorious because sailors would stop off at the island and take cuttings of this willow. And subsequently, there are millions of this Napoleon's willow planted all over the world. In fact, Kew actually had one up until 1847, 57, I think. But the wood is actually in their economic botany department. And I love the silhouette of Napoleon looking over at his tomb. It's very clever. Now, while at Napoleon, he was wandering around and he came across this particular plant. And this is Syncephalum dulcificum, which is commonly known as the miracle fruit or miracle berry, on account of its ability to make the taste buds believe that sour food is actually sweet. And he wrote, "I first became acquainted with the miraculous berry produced by this little rosaceous plant. The berry is oblong, about half the size of a small damson and of a red color. The pulp covering the stone has the power of sweetening the palate. I am not aware that this interesting little plant has ever been introduced into the stores of England." Now, this berry, which Freeman encountered in 1838, is indigenous throughout the region, but it was actually first observed in 1725 by the French cartographer and slave ship captain Chevalier Reynaud de Marquez. And he traveled in the name of the King of France, trying to find potential areas for procuring slaves. And he documented the sweetening properties and saying that the indigenous people used it when they were eating maize bread that was slightly stale or to sweeten their palm wine. And then in 1852, 14 years after Freeman mentions this plant, Dr. William Daniel, a British Army surgeon and botanist, actually collected the plant for the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And then he wrote about the plant in the Pharmaceutical Journal in the same year. But of course, we must not forget that his first calling was to bring Christianity to the area. And ever since he'd arrived on the Gold Coast, he was absolutely desperate to go to Kumasi. And he had been warned that this was really a foolhardy venture, but he was determined. And at Cape Coast Castle, he was described as having the wisdom of a politician with the zeal of the missionary, as well as an elastic buoyancy of temperament, whatever that might mean. Therefore, armed with these attributes and a letter of recommendation from Governor Maclean and 2 native soldiers, he set off to get to the kingdom, the Ashanti kingdom, which lay 200 miles in the interior. And traveling around wasn't easy because a lot of the roads were just sort of a couple of feet wide, if that. And so he traveled in hammocks like most Europeans did. But this contraption, basically, it was at best undignified and at worst extremely dangerous, because Freeman had already had an incident where he was pitched out of one of those. So most of the time he actually tended to walk instead of wander around looking ridiculous like that. Now, dipping into his journal again, as he was heading towards Kumasi, he says, "This day I went on a botanizing excursion, found many interesting plants, such as Bletia guineensis, a species of orchid, also a variety of albuca, Pana indica, and a species of crostacum and other special ferns." And when he finally arrived within a couple of days of Kumasi, he was kept waiting while he was being, while they were surveilling him, because the king had said that Freeman's laid-back demeanor was extremely suspicious. So they decided to just leave him stewing while they observed him. And of course, he went out botanizing. And he came across various orchids of sort of some wonderful descriptions in his journal. But he writes, "I saw a splendid species of epidendrum clinging to a tree at a considerable height from the ground. Anxious to obtain it, I sent a person up the tree. The man, having obtained it, descended in safety. He was eventually allowed to have an audience with the king, and following a positive consultation, he was allowed to proceed as long as he could actually raise the funds for a mission house. A year later, Birch Freeman returned home to England. This was June 1840. And he traveled all over the country, preaching, raising funds for the mission. He visited family and friends, but he also visited poor Betsy's parents in Nantwich. He returned to Orwell Park, where he presented the Harlands with a host of rare plants, and Lady Harland actually had to have a special glass house built in order to house these valuable specimens. Now, in recent weeks, thanks to Lisa Temple Cox, who actually created the tray that was at the beginning of my presentation, we have actually managed to unearth some plant material at the Ipswich archives with Sir Robert Harland's name on them. And because they're West African plants, it's obvious that Thomas Birch Freeman would have sent them to him. So we're waiting to see what else is going to turn up. Now, during this trip, Birch Freeman suddenly married Lucinda Cowan from Bedminster in Bristol. And so she sailed back to Cape Coast Castle with him in early December. But this time they took with them 6 other missionaries and their wives. However, within 2 years, they will all be dead, including Lucinda, who died when she was carrying their first child. Back in the 1830s, as part of the peace treaty, the British government had taken 2 princes, Ashanti princes, to be educated in England. So they were a sort of like security for the peace treaty. And some of you will be familiar about the ill-fated Niger expedition of 1841, where an awful lot of the crew just sort of died through disease and various other mishaps. And these 2 princes were put on board the HMS Albert to come back to the Gold Coast. And on arrival, they were handed over to Birch Freeman for them to be returned to their uncle, King Kwakadoa in Kumasi. Now, not long after he set off back to Kumasi with the princes, but he'd also brought an awful lot of presents because he had realized that they liked in Kumasi or in the region, they liked to give presents and receive presents. So he brought a whole lot of presents. And he brought a pair of leather boots for the king, 2 paintings from the Queen, one of Her Majesty and one of Windsor Castle, wine glasses, decanter, crystal chandelier, several ladies' frocks, and a phaeton carriage, which you can see here being carried. This is Mr. Freeman and the 2 princes here and 2 other missionaries. Now, the impracticality of transporting this carriage soon became apparent when they were traveling through 9-inch wide paths through the forest, and Operation Phaeton kicked in. And the minor chiefs, as they were traveling through the forest, began to send people ahead to clear a path for them to get through to Kumasi. And they had to take it apart several times and reassemble it. And once they got to Kumasi, then they sort of put it all together again, gave it a quick polish, and off it went. And it took 340 men to transport the carriage and the presents. And to Freeman's eternal delight and relief, this was carried out with little animosity between the Fanti and the Ashanti people. At Kumasi, Birch Freeman recorded a wonderful conversation with the king. Kwakadoa asked me if palm wine could be obtained in England. I told him it could not, but palm trees were grown in large glass houses heated by fire. And there were thousands of plants and trees from all over the world. I then told him that I was looking for plants to take back to England with me. He seemed slightly amused and asked if the plants I took home lived through the journey. I told him that several of them were thriving when I last left England. Now, unusually for Birch Freeman, he was actually given a Ghanaian name, Kwaku Anan. Kwaku, which is Wednesday for the day that he arrived on the Gold Coast or the day that he would have been born, and Anan, meaning fourth son, because he was the fourth missionary that the Methodist had sent. And it's unclear whether other missionaries ever had this privilege, but I do get the feeling that people sensed that Birch Freeman was slightly different from everybody else. And as for the carriage, apparently there were reports later that the king did actually use it in ceremonial pageants, but in a restricted area. Freeman set about establishing his mission, and he laid many foundation stones for churches and schools. He also spent most of the time botanizing and collecting plants and insects. And he says, "These immense forests are full of objects of the highest interest to every lover of nature. The damp recesses produce the most splendid variety of ferns, mosses, which afford shelter and support for many kinds of moths and crustaceous insects, etc. The insects in the neighborhood are very fine. Many of the butterflies are large, double the size of the purple emperor of England." Freeman returned to England for the second and last time in 1844, and once again he embarked on a tour of the country, preaching and raising money. Freeman kept in close contact with the abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson, and he also spent several days at the home of the MP and social reformer, Sir Thomas Fowle Buxton at North Reps Hall in Norfolk, who was also part of the Niger expedition. While there, Freeman also held several meetings with the colonial secretary, Lord Stanley, exploring the possibilities of new treaties in West Africa. And in a letter, in a letter to an unidentified man, Freeman wrote apologizing that he had not sent the seeds that he had promised, and he would do so as soon as he got back to Africa. On his return to the Gold Coast, Birch Freeman's star continued to rise, and he eventually married again in 1854, this time to a highly educated Indigenous woman called Rebecca. And I'm delighted to say that I am now in regular contact with Neben, who is Birch Freeman's great-great-great-great-grandson. Was that an extra great or not enough greats? And also his wife, Jean, who live in Washington, DC, and have provided me with some excellent family photos and information of Freeman's descendants. By 1856, an ongoing dispute with the missionary community led to Freeman's resignation. And initially he took a post as the administrative and civil commandant of the Accra district before setting his sights back onto his first passion, which was horticulture. Now, from about 1840, Freeman had been importing plants from the UK, seeds, plants, and I have sort of 3 or 4 pages of different sorts of plants which he was bringing in. So it's unclear when he actually set up his initial model farm, but by 1852, he was running an industrial agricultural school with the encouragement of the local governor, who spoke very highly of his endeavours back to various people in England. And it was recorded that Mr. Freeman has given the name of Beulah to his beautiful plantation. He not only gave himself these agricultural pursuits, but went to considerable lengths in the interest of science to procure rare and valuable species of orchids from the forests. And from Beulah, Freeman would almost certainly have been sending seeds and plants to a variety of people. I keep coming across letters from people thanking him for all these boxes of curiosities and whatnot, but nobody's had the decency to actually say what was in the boxes. So I know he was sending people things, but anyway, we'll find out. Now, at Beulah, he was growing all sorts of things, not only local fruits and vegetables, but he was also growing things like mangel wurzels. And for any of the uninitiated, I think it's a type of sweet that's mainly fed to animals, I think. But anyway, he was succeeding in growing there. And his roses were said to be absolutely outstanding. In 1862, Sir Richard Francis Burton visited Birch Freeman. He actually travelled to Accra to see Birch Freeman, which would indicate that Birch Freeman was now recognised in his field. And Sir Francis was surprised to see the extent of Birch Freeman's agricultural paradise. And he later published quite an extensive article about his travels. And he says, Mr. Freeman, by degrees, has reclaimed 14 acres, of which 8 are under coffee, despite a plague of lizards. Meanwhile, he grows maize, peppers, radishes, rhubarb, etc. His pomegranates will not ripen. His muscatel grapes must be guarded by bags against wasps. His coffee shrubs are all grown from seeds. Mr. Freeman owned about 8,000 shrubs of various sizes. Now, Birch Freeman actually acquired a lot of his seed from the coffee trees that were being cultivated at Cape Palmas, which is on the southernmost tip of Liberia. And Burton goes on to list the many tropical trees and shrubs and exotic plants which Birch Freeman had been collecting for a while and cultivating at Beulah. Now, for many, many years, the main coffee grown in the British colonies had been Coffea Arabica. And 7 years after Burton's visit to Freeman, it was widely being reported that plants were being destroyed by a leaf rust called Hemileia vastatrix. And over a period of about 2 or 3 years, this near monoculture exacerbated the problem. And it was widely reported that these plants were now being decimated on a large scale. And there are letters in Kew between Freeman and Sir Joseph Hooker. He was the then director at Kew. And in 1872, writing from Beulah Gardens, Freeman responded to a letter from Hooker, and he says, I have the honour to acknowledge the receipt of your letter. Sorry, I have the honour to receive the letter with the accompanying copy of a letter from Dr. Hooker of the Royal Gardens at Kew. And here he's actually inquiring about seeds of the Liberian coffee. And he goes on and says, I have many healthy young plants of this valuable variety of coffee, and have therefore the pleasure of forwarding to your Excellency upwards of 200 of the seeds required. From what I have experienced of the habits of this variety of coffee, I am of the opinion that if it be desired to introduce it to Ceylon to as great extent as may be practicable, the berries will travel safely, with many thanks for the seeds from Kew enclosed in your letters. Now, what this letter shows is that Birch Freeman was very much aware of the unfolding catastrophes of the coffee industry in the wider world and the urgency required to try and find a solution, and also his willingness to help. And so he then goes on at great lengths to describe how these seeds could be collected and cleaned so that they will still retain their viability before they were sort of sent off. And then in April, he then writes, I am very glad to find that the seeds of coffee changed hands in good condition, and I shall feel a pleasure in sending you more seeds. I assure you of my readiness to correspond with you on any horticultural question in which you may feel interested. Now, this was the beginning of several years of correspondence between Freeman, Kew, and the wider colonies. Within a year of the cultivation of Freeman seeds at Kew, several Wardian cases or portable greenhouses of plants were distributed to tropical botanical gardens throughout the colonies. Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, was one of the very first places to receive and appreciate the potential value of this new plant. Plants to India, Java, Trinidad, Jamaica soon followed. These were all distributed on an experimental basis, and Kew carried on monitoring them for several years. And in 1873, the Kew Progress Report from Hooker encouragingly reported that the Liberian coffee was most prolific and robust, and the seed raised from Mr. Freeman seemed to be ticking all the boxes effectively. And he said, I'm thoroughly convinced that the Liberian coffee in time will take the place of our native coffee, if I may so call it. He also very enthusiastically added how much he hoped that the Liberian coffee variety may prove less liable to the fungus. In January 1877, a list of questions on the cultural requirements of Liberian coffee was sent to Freeman on the Gold Coast. And one of them was inquiring as to whether any of his plants had ever succumbed to Hemileia's vastatrix. And in April 1878, the Ceylon Observer actually printed all of Birch Freeman's responses to each of the questions so that all the planters could receive the information, especially on the question of rust. And Freeman had actually reported that he had never witnessed any signs of this particular rust on any of his plants. Now, Freeman's pivotal role in recommending the potential solution to the coffee crisis in the colonies resulted in him becoming somewhat of an authority on Liberian coffee. As the plantation growers became more and more excited with this new coffee's potential, the nurseryman, William Bull, The nurseryman, William Bull, the King's Road, Chelsea, began to import his own seeds and some live plants. And he began a commercial he started growing everything on a commercial scale and advertising it extremely aggressively. And he did this under the name Coffea Arabica. And the botanist and mathematician William Hearn then described this new species and subsequently adopted William Bull's name. Hearn then validly published this name, described it in the 1875 Transactions of the Linnean Society, as well as in the 3rd volume of the Flora of Tropical Africa. At the age of 64, not long after sending the coffee seeds to Kew, Birch Freeman, who was now widely known as Father Freeman, the Bishop of the Gold Coast, he formally returned to the ministry and took up his religious pursuits once more. But he did continue to correspond with Kew, and he provided them with quite a lot of information on economic plants and whether they would be sort of useful culturally, economically in various colonies. Now, interestingly, throughout all of this, all his time on the west coast of Africa, he never learned to speak any of the languages or any of the many dialects. And it wasn't want of trying, he just was not very good at languages. So he always had an interpreter with him. Birch Freeman died on the 12th of August, 1890, 52 years after him and Betsy landed on the Gold Coast. And in that year, the Kew Bulletin published a piece on Liberian coffee, and they wrote, through the aid of the acting administrator, 480 seeds were obtained from the Reverend T.B. Freeman, who had a small plantation of the coffee on the Seacombe River near Accra. The plants raised from these seeds at Kew were the first grown in this country. And this is the 2009 commemorative bust of Freeman taking pride of place at the cathedral in Accra. Now, when I visited the Economic Botany Department in Kew in 2021, I was completely beside myself when I finally got my hands on some of the seeds that Birch Freeman sent all those years ago. Now, sadly, Liberian coffee began to lose its advantage, and eventually it actually succumbed to the coffee leaf rust and was later largely replaced by coffee conifera, also known as Robusta. Some Arabica plantations were so destroyed that they eventually turned to tea plantations. Also, according to consumers in London, coffee Liberica had a sort of a bitter taste, and it wasn't very palatable, totally inferior to Arabica. However, today, the rising temperatures, as well as erratic rainfall, disease, drought, are threatening the coffee industry's two coffee species. And Arabica and Robusta are still being grown all over the country and all over the world. However, Dr. Aaron Davis, head of the research at Kew, the coffee research at Kew, and his team have been conducting extensive research to develop Coffea Arabica as a sustainable crop for coffee farming communities, and also to try and introduce some kind of diversity, genetic diversity within the coffee industry. And if you want to know more about Coffea Arabica, Dr. Davis has written a fabulous paper on it, which is easily available. Coffea Arabica is now widely grown in the Philippines and Malaysia as a commercial crop, especially, and well, mind you, especially in some of the more sort of quirky coffee houses in the UK. Coffea Arabica has actually made a huge comeback and is raising a lot of interest. And it is now being described as hipster coffee. I kid you not. Undoubtedly, this would have raised a wry smile from the Reverend Birch Freeman. And so, having waited in the wings effectively for about 150 years, I think it's really time for Coffea Arabica to emerge and shine. To conclude, as I write each chapter of Birch Freeman's life, I discovered something new to reveal a person who was not only devoted to his religion, but also extremely passionate about plants, people, and the sciences. There is no doubt that he collected, nurtured, and shared more seeds and specimens than we can at present acknowledge. The Reverend Thomas Birch Freeman was more than a missionary. He was a botanist, a horticulturalist, a pioneer, an educationalist. And throughout his time on the Gold Coast, Freeman was also an advocate, an advisor, and occasionally an ambassador for the British government. My research aims to redress the lack of recognition and in time enable his name to appear alongside other notable Victorian botanists and plant collectors. And I will leave you with this wonderful fabric that was commissioned to commemorate the 1935 centenary of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Ghana. And they have these beautiful yellow climbing roses with John Wesley and the Reverend Thomas Birch Freeman. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
I will remember. Thank you.
Thank
I curated justice, and on my travels, I met Jacqueline the case, who was very keen to be invited to the Botanic Garden from.
Oh, really?
So quite a long time, we corresponded on the oldest. Thinking of the newest.
Okay.
Really set up the Botanic Gardens Research Institute before they were terrible repair.
Okay.
And he took it over. Have you been in touch with him by any chance?
No, I haven't. But
Really, really get in touch with you.
I would love to get in touch with you.
Change.
Yeah.
It's funny to get in touch with exactly on this thread. But
Oh, is he? I love Instagram. It's worked out.
so much, really edifying.
Thank you. You're welcome. I think I've stunned everybody. I tend to have that effect.
There is a question, so if you want to read it out, it's right here. Freeman was read it out.
Freeman was a contemporary to Darwin, born in the same year. Did he ever express views as a churchman or as a naturalist on Darwin's theories? Not that I'm aware of. However, I haven't finished transcribing his journals, so I don't know. However, what's interesting about the fact that an awful lot of naturalists were churchmen is the fact that they had this deep interest in what they called the works of God. And so plants, animals, anything like that, they were keen on sort of discovering what was going on, so which is why a lot of churchmen did. So I'm not sure whether, it depends. Watch this space while I'm scribbling, going through the journals. And is that, did Freeman use Wardian cases?
If you want to read it out, right.
Did Freeman use Wardian cases to transport the plants back to the UK? Again, the answer is I don't know, but it would have been quite early on, because I think the Wardian case was around in the 1830s. So it would have been quite early on, but possibly, I don't know, is the answer to that. So another one? Yeah. Are there? Oh yeah. Many thanks for the fascinating talk. You're welcome. Any of the tropical plants that Reverend Freeman brought from Africa to the UK still alive at Kew or other botanical gardens in the UK? I don't know if they are, because I am working quite closely with Kew, because they're trying to re-establish Coffea Arabica at Kew. And so I'm really looking forward to them actually getting a specimen if they haven't already. But I know that there is something at the Ceylon Botanic Garden that is still growing. I think it may well be one of the coffee things. I'm not sure. So I'm not going to put my money down on that one. So I'm not sure at all. Is that a question?
Yeah. Was there any evidence?
Oh, yeah. Is there any evidence as to whether or not he used photography on his travels, cumbersome and difficult human climate in the late 19th century? But it would be interesting to know. Thank you. No, he didn't carry anything like that. But I know that he used to carry a gun and a telescope and also lots of books of orchids, coloured books for orchids.
This is the last one.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Were any of his other species of seeds and plants commercialized via Kew? The answer to that is I don't know, again, as yet. A lot of the information I'm getting is from his journals, as I said, as I'm sort of transcribing them, I'm getting names which I'm then going off and researching to try and find out what he might have sent them. These people that keep saying, thank you very much for the curiosity. So I've got several names that I'm going to be hunting them down to try and find out what he actually did send these people and where they ended up. As I said, thanks to Lisa, hopefully we will come up with some more specimens or samples of some of the things he sent in the Ipswich Museum, because they're recataloguing all their stuff at the moment. Any more questions? Yes? Oh.
I wonder if he hosted any other missionary naturalists while he was in Beulah. I'm thinking in particular of Fairfield Livingston, who stopped off in West Africa on their way out to the Zambezi.
Can you repeat the question? Probably what I was doing not here.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
The gentleman just asked whether Birch Freeman hosted any other naturalists or plant collectors, because Livingston and Ian, yeah, apparently they stopped off in West Africa. I don't know, it wouldn't surprise me if there were other people that he did get in contact with. As I said, there are lots of names that crop up all the time, but I don't necessarily know who they are. And I haven't come across Livingston, but yes, I think he would have done, because there are lots of names. The letterbooks that I showed right at the beginning, there are hundreds of them, absolutely hundreds of them, and sort of they're addressed to all sorts of people. And I've sort of got this crazy spreadsheet that I'm sort of trying to connect people. And I also know that he used to get some of the missionaries when they went off to certain parts of the village, he would get them to collect specific stuff for him to bring back. So it would have been things that he would have seen himself. And I don't know, maybe they were in seed and not in flower, and he wanted the seeds or whatever. And so I've come across letters of him asking people to do that. So any more questions? The lady here.
I'm going back to the names issue. Is there any way you're going to be able to put some of these names up on your website so we can help you try and find out what collections they have? Whether they are one we can link to this?
I hadn't thought about that, but that's actually a really good idea. Yeah, that was somebody else agreeing there to do some donkey work for me. I'm not going to turn that down. That's a really good idea, actually. Yes, next year, I'm actually sort of, getting down to sort of some serious research. So yes, absolutely.
Have you got a public survey?
So some and some, not some and some, if you will. What's this space? Oh, talking about publishing, may I?
Yeah.
I've only got a few. So. I've just written, in the process of writing, short history of flowers, which is available to pre-order. It's out next February. And the book is actually about 60 plants, flowers, and some of the stories that are attached to them. And what I've done is that I've tried to avoid the usual suspects. So I've gone for sort of, you know, completely different kinds of plants. And any that I've actually, any usual suspects that I have included, they've got completely different stories that you would never envisage. So, was that good?
The same.
Oh, okay, thank you. Any more questions? Or are you all ready for a glass of wine?
Yeah, I've been thinking about, bear in mind you must have been discovering, so it's been often on the past and then hunting around in that. So what you were discovering must have been something to do like LOE actually new.
Yeah.
And give an explanation of why it doesn't seem to have got any credit as to the contact to the booklet. Is it because of maybe a missionary for just doing mission focus on side, or because of social factors that seems to be remarkable that it's
I'm really sorry. Ask you to repeat it because there's some people on the number complaining about the question.
Oh. Sorry.
I know it's difficult.
Trying to remember what it said. I was trying to make. So basically, you're asking why he's not better known. Yeah. So the gentleman is sort of wanting to know why Birch Freeman wasn't so well known, and sort of why he hasn't made more of an impact. That is a really interesting question because when we travelled to Ghana, we did notice that there are an awful lot of the sort of Birch Freeman things, their schools and their all sorts of things. So his name is there, but just purely under the religious banner. And another interesting thing is that they were not aware of his botanical side at all. And in fact, quite a lot of them were quite sort of astonished, especially when I sort of start talking about this. And so when we traveled there, the archivists were sort of quite, you know, sort of taken aback because they're so used to people coming to research Birch Freeman, but only his religious stuff. And so I don't know why his botanic, maybe it's because he didn't come back home again to sort of present things and to be actually, yeah, I think it's because he sent them to people who would have put them in their collections, or they would have done whatever. They might have shared them with their friends. So Robert Harland was a member of the Botanical Society. So he would have received some of these specimens, but I think it's because Birch Freeman himself did not bring them back for, yeah, obvious reasons.
Okay, I think that's clear.
Are we done? Yes, lovely.
Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you very much, Advolly Richmond, for joining us this evening. And just to also invite you all upstairs to come and see our display about celebrating the 200th anniversary of Alfred Russel Wallace that is up in the library upstairs. There's also an opportunity to have a drink, a chat, I believe. You would all be very welcome upstairs, and look also at our other displays that we have on the way up to the library. But it's also my great pleasure to say thank you for what I knew was going to be a fascinating talk. And you wonder the way you blend all those different stories together is amazing. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Advolly for